Record. Oke. Mbak Inaya. Mbak Inaya, silahkan kalau mau dimulai.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Very nice to virtually meet you on this Saturday. Good evening to Professor Ahmet Kuru. My name is Inaya Rakhmani. I will be your host, moderator, chair for today's discussion. We are having the great pleasure to have distinguished Professor Ahmet Kuru, author of Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, which was translated into Bahasa Indonesia and has gained wide attention in our country. Saya akan coba alih bahasa di satu saat atau saat lainnya supaya diskusi mengalir dan lebih inklusif kepada orang-orang yang mungkin merasa lebih nyaman dalam bahasa Indonesia. Pada saat sesi tanya jawab juga boleh gunakan chat box, juga boleh gunakan bahasa Indonesia, nanti saya bantu terjemahkan. Buku Prof. Kuru, Islam Otoritarianisme dan Ketertinggalan, diterbitkan oleh Kompas dan bisa dibeli melalui e-books, dan juga ada banyak ulasan. There are many reviews of Professor Kuru's book in Bahasa Indonesia in various national medias in Indonesia. His book thesis is very important and relevant to the Indonesian case, while not directly speaking about contemporary history, not directly speaking about the Indonesian case, tapi ada banyak sekali titik-titik yang menurut kami di MIKo penting untuk kita refleksikan mengenai posisi Indonesia di abad 21 pada kondisi pandemi, dan semoga diskusinya bermanfaat, menyenangkan, dan juga mendekatkan hubungan-hubungan sosial kita yang terputus pada masa pandemi. Ahmed, I just said that hopefully through this discussion, reflections regarding your book in the Indonesian case, for the Indonesian case in 21st century pandemic situation, especially when social connections have become cut and needed to adjust to new spaces, can give us this very much needed hub, at least for these 2 hours, for us to reflect, to give a breather to ourselves in the face of the ongoing pandemic and these rapid transformations that affect all of us all around the world. Tanpa berpanjang-panjang, saya akan serahkan floor kepada Pak Dekan, also a dear colleague and friend of mine, Mas Philips Formonte, to give a welcoming speech. Waktu dan tempat, Mas Philips, saya persilahkan. Time and place is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Inaya. Very good morning to everyone, and good evening to Professor Kuru in the United States. I'm here because on behalf of Professor Komarudin Hidayat, he apologizes that he could not attend this discussion this morning because of some conflicting schedule that he had. So, but he convey his highest regard to Professor Ahmet Kuru. Thank you for your willingness to share some thoughts on the topic that we have chosen this morning. And I'm going to describe a little bit about MIKo, Membaca Indonesia Kontemporer, liberally translated into reading contemporary Indonesia. This is a group of people who has some kind of routine discussions on topics that we deem important for us to understand and to discuss. This is started as a small circle discussion group, but then Professor Komar decided to expand the circle a little bit, and then organize some discussions involving people outside the initial circle. And now we, because of the pandemic, this is the silver lining, is that we are able to invite overseas speakers to be a source person for the discussion. And for Professor Ahmet Kuru, as Mbak Inaya earlier mentioned, that his book is now widely read. I think not only in Indonesia. I've seen on the Professor Kuru's social media platform that the book has been translated into so many languages. I think it's a testament to the relevance and to the intriguing and thought-provoking nature of the book that especially the global Muslim community now takes a lot of interest in the arguments made by the book. But today we will discuss more about the contemporary situation, Islam, democracy, and the pandemic. Because why is it the topic? We've seen the effect of the pandemic and the slowness of so many governments across the globe. And one of the reasons that has been put as the explanation as to why global community is very slow in responding is probably culture. And then the culture is probably shaped by norms and so on, maybe based on your long experience in the understanding Islamic community, Islamic thought and thinking, and then the leadership, you may be able to to enlighten us of what would be the nature of this relationship between the pandemic, culture, and probably Islam in today's pandemic. Because as we know, this pandemic is not the first time, and it's not going to be the last time as well. So we might to dig in from the past, probably, from the experience of the former Islamic sultanates, if you will, and then that would be a good reference for today's pandemic and probably for future pandemics that we need to anticipate. And thank you very much. I won't take much time, but I would like to thank everybody who takes time to join in this morning discussion. Saturday morning should be your precious time, taking some rest, but decide to to squeeze your brain a little bit this morning to have a discussion with Professor Ahmet Kuru and all of us today. Thank you. Back to you, Inaya.
Thank you, Mas Phillips. Making our brains maybe more flexible, increased plasticity, so that with intellectual exercise, actually it lessens our burdens to respond to difficult situations that affect all of us all around the world. Thank you so much for your welcome speech. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Ahmet Kuru, Bruce E. Porteus Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University. He has written extensively, among others, Secularism and State Policies Towards Religion in 2009, and a co-edited book with Alfred Stepan, Democracy, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey, and also in various journals like World Politics, Comparative Politics, and Political Science Quarterly. For those in political sciences and social sciences, you would notice that Professor Ahmet Kuru's approach with social history is quite unique in comparison to the positivistic, quantitative-based survey approach and generalizable models that is more popular in the United States, which has affected the kind of literature that is written on democracy, secularism, and Islam all around the world. His most recent book, Islam, Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, speaks so extensively about the rise of civilizations, whether in the Muslim or the Western world, and how these are have been driven by intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Ahmet. Time and place is yours. You have approximately 20 minutes, but feel free to nudge me if you need more time. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Ahmed, your video is frozen. Are you able to connect? Kayaknya freeze ya, Mas Adi, videonya. Mungkin sambil kita menunggu Prof. Kuru sign in. Ahmed, are you still here with us?
Ya, mungkin froze. Mungkin sambil menunggu.
Kayaknya internetnya ya.
Ya, dia lagi
Iya,
mungkin mau
ternyata di Amerika juga ya, kirain cuma di Indonesia.
Mbak Inaya, saya lupa
Ya, Mas.
sesuatu, sedikit advertisement. Profesor Ahmet Kuru is kind enough he's now teaching at Universitas Islam International Indonesia this semester, teaching on the subject of religion and democracy, master level course for full semester. Sambil menunggu Pak Kuru kembali.
That's quite unusual. Itu jarang ya Mas di Indonesia ada profesor dari negara lain yang full ngajar gitu selama 1 semester.
Yeah.
Di kampus saya pun juga.
Thanks to the Zoom. Thanks to Zoom.
Itu silabusnya dikembangkan bersama Mas Philips.
Silabus dari Prof Kuru.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Menarik banget karena kampus-kampus di Indonesia kan ngalamin ini ya, kesulitan untuk mengundang profesor dari negara lain karena mata anggaran biasanya. Dan juga borang-borang admin yang kadang nggak mengakomodasi. Jadi UI mesti belajar mungkin dari UI.
UI kan orang tuanya UII, cucunya, anaknya UII yang di Jogja.
Ini nunggu I4 ya di situ. Nambah I tiap tahun.
Nah ini Prof. Ahmet.
Hi Ahmed, I see you've moved gadgets. Thank you for being so flexible. We just talked a bit about your class for 1 semester on democracy and Islam in UII. And now back to you, Ahmed. Time and place is yours. You have 20 minutes, if not more. You're still on mute. Can you unmute your microphone, please?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Hello?
very clearly.
Okay. So
Mbak Pamela, wait a minute. Mbak Pamela, mungkin Pak Ahmed bisa dijadikan co-host, Mbak? Would you like to appoint Pak Ahmed as co-host?
So, in fact, for some reason, I couldn't. So I was cut out in my laptop. Now I am connecting with you from the iPhone, and I will make the 5-minute introduction with the iPhone. If my computer works, I will show you the PowerPoint presentation. Otherwise, we'll just continue with the iPhone. So now, can you hear me now clearly right now?
Very clearly.
Okay. So it's very nice to be with friends. I hope, inshallah, I will also visit you in person in Indonesia. I am very thankful to Inaya, Mas Adi, and Mas Philip for organizing and for kind introduction. And I'm very happy to see the distinguished audience, including Dr. Wadi Hadiz and others. Basically, since the publication of my book, I have always received questions about Indonesia. Since this is the largest Muslim population on earth, and people ask whether the argument in my book is only limited to Indonesia, but whether they could explain Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. And since the translation of my book was published last year, I have been engaged with many Indonesian intellectuals, scholars, and friends, and try to learn more about this important country. And I'm very happy that Indonesian friends, on the one hand, they teach me about Indonesia, and on the other hand, they find my book very relevant. I think on 2 points we can discuss, and I wrote a specific preface to my book's Indonesian edition, emphasizing these 2 points. One point is that Indonesia proves, or Indonesia is an exception that proves the rule, which is that once you have low degree of ulama state alliance and low degree of oil revenues, you have more chances of democratization and development. That's how in Indonesia, with lower degree of ulama state alliance than Middle East, we have more opportunities and experience of democratization. The second point is that even in Indonesia, the religion-state relations in general, ulama-state relations in particular, is very complex. That's why many friends told me that the translation of my book was timely in a way that it really made part of debate in Indonesia. What is the role of Islam? What is the role of Islamic law Sharia? How ulama and state should engage? What should be the boundary between them? And what is the Middle Eastern or Central Asian or South Asian history and today's practice that Indonesians can learn and understand and reflect on? And recently I wrote a very brief article on Islam in Indonesia, specifically discussing NU, and it has been immediately translated to 7 languages. That shows that the world really wants to learn more about Indonesia, and Islam in Indonesia appeal interest of readers worldwide. So after today's presentation and discussion, tomorrow I have an interview pre-recorded in the Ubud Festival in Bali, and I think 8 a.m. Jakarta time, 9 a.m. Bali time. And the questions in the interview that we already recorded was also how my book engaged with Indonesian case. So let me briefly summarize the argument, then explain how it can be related to Indonesia, and finally refer to some contemporary challenges we have as Mas Philip summarizes. It's about COVID and other global challenges. So just give me a minute to check whether my computer is working. If it is not, I will just explain without the PowerPoint. If it works, we can try that one. Just 1 minute.
Take your time, Ahmed,
Sure.
while you try to manage. The committee has asked me to kindly say hello to Professor Fedi Hadis, Director of the Asia Institute in University of Melbourne. He's also the author of Islamic Populism, and actually Ahmed, through his email to us, the committee, asked if Professor Hadis would be willing to attend, and now he's here. There's also Bapak Emir Hairullah and Pak Asrufin yang merupakan mantan Dubes Uzbekistan. Salam sehat, Pak. Selamat datang. Hopefully this is a good moment of reflection for all of us. Ahmed, are you managing with your laptop?
So for some reason, laptop is not working, and then maybe it will be more natural and unique to have this iPhone I never done before. Let's do it, inshallah. So
Okay.
Let me summarize the argument. When we look at the world today, out of 49 Muslim majority countries, only 7 are electoral democracies, and Indonesia is one of them. And socioeconomic problems in the Muslim world are just associated with the problem of authoritarianism. Therefore, they really establish a vicious circle. And this really puzzling because the Muslim world was historically more developed than Western Europe in terms of economic development and scientific progress. So when we look at the literature, even the daily discussion, from the United States to Middle East, there are those who blame Islam as a source of problem and those who blame Western colonization. And very briefly, I would say that I do not simply trash these 2 arguments. I engage with them in each chapter, but show their weaknesses, that blaming Islam is really unable to explain how Muslims were so successful between 8th and 11th centuries. Even after 11th centuries, Muslims continued to produce philosophers like Ibn Khaldun and cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul. And today they show some variation, as Indonesia and until recently Tunisia as democracies, whereas many others authoritarian regimes. Colonization argument has weaknesses too, because when the colonization began, especially in the Middle East in the 18th, 19th centuries, the stagnation already there. Plus, many Latin American and Asian countries achieved certain degree of democracy and development despite being colonial. Last but not least, normatively, just focusing to colonial experience and blaming the foreign intervention uncover domestic internal problems of Muslim societies. That's really problematic. We have to focus internal problems to find solutions. So what is the argument then, if it is neither Islam nor colonization? It's basically the relationship between four classes: religious, political, economic, and scholarly classes. In early Islamic history, especially between 8th and 11th centuries, the religious class put a distance between themselves and the political class. About 90% of ulama, Islamic scholars, were independent, mostly funded by commerce. Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, Hanbali refused to serve the state. Only few served the state as qadi, but they were minority. And at that time, there was a clergy-state alliance in Western Europe. Catholic Church leaders were appointed by monarchs, and the German kings, Holy Roman emperors, were designing the clergy. But after the 11th century, gradually a reversal happened. In Western Europe, we see the institutionalization of church-state separation, the rise of universities, the rise of city-states with a dynamic intellectual class and a bourgeois class. Europe achieved Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution. Whereas in the Muslim world, for various reasons, we saw that after the 11th century, an alliance emerged, what I call ulama state alliance. There were economic reasons for this transformation. Because of an economic crisis in the 10th and 11th centuries, the Muslim governments, starting with Central Asia, then Iran and Iraq, moving gradually to Syria and Egypt, embrace a system called iqta, which basically means land revenue assignment and distribution. Because of the lack of cash or currency in state budget, from the Abbasis to especially Seljuks, this semi-feudal economic system of iqta, later Ottomans call it tımar system, became the new model that replaced the old economy. The old economy was better in the certain areas because it was monetary and based on private ownership. But the new system after the 11th century, marginalized merchants, marginalized private entrepreneurs, established this semi-feudal iqta system. This economic change coincides with a political change. The Seljuk Empire in Central Asia, Iraq, and Iran established a military empire, and this conquest-based military invasion-based empire further institutionalized iqta system and marginalized private entrepreneurs. And then the scholarship need funding. Then funding became also centralized with the Prime Minister Grand Vizier of the Seljuks, Nizamül Mulk. He established a chain of madrasas called Nizamiye madrasas. And these Nizamiye madrasas produce a particular group of scholars, ulama, who were prone to serve the state. And the best product of this madrasa system was a genius scholar, Ghazali. Ghazali was and has been regarded as the most influential figure in Islam after Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And he wrote books to make the ulama state alliance stronger and the two enemies of this system weaker. One enemy was philosophers. Ghazali wrote Tahafutul Falasafa, the incoherence of philosophers. Declared Ibn Sina and Farabi, kafir, infidel, and their followers punishable by death for three reasons that we can elaborate on Q&A. The second book he wrote, attacking the second group, was against Shia, Ismaili Shia, and also declaring them punishable by death. So after the establishment of ulama state alliance with economic structure, with certain anti-philosophy ideas, with Sunni orthodoxy, with military regime, this system was embraced in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt by a new empire established by Saladin called Ayyubids, then followed by Mamluk Empire. Meanwhile, between 12th and 14th centuries, there came the Crusaders and the Mongols. And these two foreign invaders, of course, they were detrimental. They destroyed cities and massacred millions of Muslims. But my argument is that the main problem of Mongol and Crusader invasions were not simply their material damage. The main problem was that they helped ulama state alliance, because when Muslim masses show they witness massacres and killings, they search for military hero. Then they sought refuge from and help from Islamic preachers. It was a human instinct. When your life was threatened, you no longer search for better philosophy, science, and arts. You seek for help from a military commander, military hero. And the military hero came in the form of Saladin in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And then Mamluks, who stopped the Mongols, became hero. But these military oligarchies further strengthened the ulama state alliance and weakened merchants and the philosophers. After the Mongols and Crusaders, Muslims established three empires, very strong, very powerful: Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal. It showed that Muslims geopolitically recover, but they never recover philosophically and to a certain extent economically. When we look at, for example, the most powerful and the long-lasting of the three, Ottoman Empire, it didn't receive the printing technology for 300 years. So I'm criticizing Ottomans for that, but Safavis and Mughals were even later to adopt printing press. So what is the result? The result is that in the 18th century, finally Muslims in Istanbul had printing press. In the Ottoman Empire, they only printed 50,000 books. But in the same century, Europeans printed 1 billion books. And when Muslims had paper technology between 8th to 12th centuries, Europeans didn't have that. As a result, Muslims had large libraries of hundreds of thousands of books, when Western Europeans had only a few hundred books in their monastery libraries. But there was a reversal of fortunes because of the decline of philosophy and science and economic entrepreneurship in the Muslim world. After the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, it was now Europeans who had large libraries of millions of books, and Muslims had smaller libraries. And in the Ottoman Empire, the estimated literacy rate in 1800 was only 1%, but it was 31% in Western Europe. So the gap we see today between schooling, literacy, scientific research in the Muslim world and Western Europe, or the Western world, already began centuries ago because of Muslims' focus on military empires and the ulama-state alliance, whereas Western societies had dynamic bourgeoisie and dynamic merchant class. So now, what is the relevancy of this argument for today? In the 19th century, many Muslim leaders, especially in Istanbul and Cairo, Ottoman Empire and Egypt, they realized the problem. They said, we have to modernize the institutions. They sidelined the ulama. And in the 20th century, most state builders were secularists. Atatürk in Turkey, Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, military generals in Algeria, Cemal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Baas Party in Syria, Baas Party in Iraq, even among Palestinians, Yasser Arafat, they were all secularist leaders. Muhammad Ali Jinnah in Pakistan. So the list is very long. So they were not as secular as Atatürk, all of them, but it was a various degree, mostly secular policies they pursued. But the problems were not solved because the secularist leaders were too state-centric. They didn't appreciate the bourgeoisie. They didn't appreciate economic entrepreneurs. Most of them were military officers with very state-centric notion, very similar to old ulama state alliances. And the failure of secularist leaders brought us Islamization. Iranian Revolution of 1979, then Islamization more bottom-up in Egypt, in different forms after Ziaul Haq in Pakistan, recently under Erdogan regime in Turkey, variation of ulama state alliances once again came back. We recently saw in Taliban the most assertive ulama taking power. And the result is further marginalization of intellectuals, further marginalization of economic entrepreneurs. So what is the relationship of this argument to Indonesia? Maybe in Q&A you can tell me more. I keep asking to my friends in Indonesia, but basically Indonesia is lucky that it doesn't have the history of madrasa structure similar to Central Asia, certain Indian subcontinent, Middle Eastern experience, not high level of ulama state alliance, more decentralized structure, having autonomous organizations, NU, Muhammadiyah, and others. So that's a plus. That's how democracy is becoming possible. And that's precious thing, certain distance between religious and political authorities or diversity. It's something precious that should be really kept cautiously. What about the challenges? Let me finish by that. So, COVID crisis and many other global challenges ask us to be pragmatic, to be really dynamic and creative. But unfortunately, Islamic actors, the ulama, the Sufi sheikhs, the Islamist politicians, they ask us Muslims and Muslim societies, even non-Muslims living in Muslim majority countries, they ask us to be passive because the preaching they do in mosques, the teaching they do in madrasas is all about conservation of the tradition. Now, in the United States, I have attended several mosques for Friday prayer. And in the khutbah sermon, there is now almost a standard of reciting a hadith saying that kullu bidatin dalalet, kullu dalaletin finnar, which means all innovation is a deviation and all deviation is in the hellfire. So if this is the mentality, it's not only Salafi Wahhabis, now even the mainstream Sunni mosques, as if it is part of Friday khutbah, they keep telling this. But this really reflects a wrong mentality that innovation is bad, and they don't put a border. Innovation in what? In what sense? And how can we adapt to COVID, global challenges? Muslims generally have had hard time to respond, even ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Recently, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I wrote an article about NU and how NU's and Pak Yahya's new initiative make a declaration about the caliphate, that it's not a necessary thing. When we look at the mainstream Muslims in the Middle East, they wrote a letter about 10 years ago asking Baghdadi to really change his policies. Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. In that letter, if you look, the mainstream ulama, including the Mufti of Egypt, Hamza Yusuf of United States, Bin Beya, who is now in United Arab Emirates, very famous names. They say that in the Arabic version, it's strict. They make it weaker in the English translation. It says that caliphate is wajib on Muslims. So to find a caliph, political leader for all Muslims worldwide is obligatory to all Muslims. What ISIS is doing only technically wrong because Baghdadi declared himself as a caliph without consensus, ijma. So this is the mentality of the ulama. Rather than criticizing the whole notion of caliphate, they just deal with technicalities. Therefore, their response to ISIS is very weak. So let me conclude then that, so this is the argument of my book. I'll be happy to elaborate any point if my friends ask questions during the Q&A session. And these are the two ways about Indonesia. Indonesia is an exception of the ulama state alliance, but there may be problems on that issue too, even in Indonesia. And finally, regarding Mas Phillips' emphasis on global challenges, we really need more dynamic, creative approaches. Just focusing on conversation, conserving the tradition is really not helpful. And we really don't need Western models for being creative. The Muslims' early history between 8th to 12th centuries, if it is examined, it is full of inspiration and models for us for the future. Thank you. And I'll be happy to answer if there are any questions.
Thank you, Ahmed. If Mas Philip, saya boleh rekap untuk orang-orang yang lebih nyaman bahasa Indonesia?
Ya, silakan, Mbak.
Okay, it would take time, Ahmed. I'm very sorry. I'm trying to capture your argument so that it's it becomes more internalized and familiar across the Indonesian audience and readers. Jadi yang barusan disampaikan Prof. Kuru adalah bahwa ada dua argumen. Yang pertama, Indonesia ini kasus khusus di dunia Muslim karena ada degree produksi minyak dan derajat hubungan antara ulama dan negara yang lebih rendah dibandingkan Timur Tengah, sehingga berdampak pula pada pengalaman demokratisasi kita. Jadi argumennya makro, tapi tugas kita sebagai Indonesia untuk refleksikannya dalam keseharian kita ketika beraktivis, melakukan aktivisme di dunia Islam baik intelektual maupun sosial. Yang kedua adalah bahkan di Indonesia, hubungan antara ulama dan negara juga sangat kompleks. Terjemahan buku Prof. Kuru yang diterbitkan oleh Kompas bertujuan untuk menjadikan ini bagian dari perdebatan lebih luas di Indonesia. Karena batasan, boundary, jarak ya antara ulama dan negara sangat penting untuk dijaga menurut Prof. Kuru, karena berdasarkan proses sejarah di Timur Tengah dan juga Asia Tengah, praktik-praktiknya itu bisa jadi bahan untuk kita refleksi. Ada artikel, berbagai artikel yang bisa Mas Adi kirimkan ya kepada kawan-kawan, kepada para kolega yang juga merangkum argumen ini, salah satunya di Kumparan. Dan juga beberapa poin yang sangat menarik ya dari paparan Prof. Kuru adalah bahwa dari 7 demokrasi elektoral di dunia muslim, Indonesia itu salah satu. Jadi jumlahnya sangat sedikit. Dan ada permasalahan sosioekonomi di dunia muslim kontemporer yang berhubungan dengan otoritarianisme. Indonesia pun juga punya sejarah panjang dengan negara otoriter di bawah Presiden Soeharto, di mana ulama juga dipinggirkan ya dari pembahasan atau dari tatanan oligarki, karena Prof. Kuru juga menyebut dan mempermasalahkan oligarki di dunia muslim pada abad 11 sampai ke-13. Dan ini sangat mengherankan bagi Prof. Kuru karena dunia muslim itu sebetulnya di awal abad 8 sampai abad 10 itu sangat membuka dialog ya, dan menjalankan prinsip-prinsip demokrasi jauh sebelum peradaban barat. Bagi Prof. Kuru, di Timur Tengah, Islam adalah sumber, baik di sekarang ya, pada masa sekarang, Islam, dan di Barat, Islam adalah sumber masalah, dan di dunia Islam yang dipersalahkan adalah penjajahan atau Western colonialization. Dalam tiap bab bukunya, Prof. Kuru itu mempertahankan argumennya dan mengaitkan argumen dalam tiap bab, dan mempermasalahkan, menyalahkan Islam maupun menyalahkan penjajahan, kolonialisme, dalam literatur dari sarjana Islam maupun literatur dari Barat. Karena bahkan dari jauh sebelum pencerahan ya, abad pencerahan di dunia Barat, sarjana seperti Ibnu Khaldun dan kota-kota kosmopolitan seperti Istanbul itu sudah bermunculan. Bagi Prof. Kuru, argumen mengenai kolonialisme yang berdampak pada otoritarianisme, pada keterbelakangan dunia muslim juga memiliki kelemahan, terutama di Timur Tengah, di mana stagnasi itu terjadi karena bukan pada intervensi asing, tapi untuk menjadi bahan refleksi bagi kita untuk mengungkap masalah-masalah domestik di dalam masyarakat muslim. Sehingga ada masalah internal di kita, di Indonesia, yang bisa ngambil manfaat dari paparan Prof. Kuru dalam bukunya. Isu yang ditekankan adalah ekonomi, agama, dan politik. Lalu yang kedua adalah kelas-kelas intelektual atau kesarjanaan. Pada abad 8, 80% sarjana di Timur Tengah itu bersifat independen karena didanai oleh merchant atau pedagang, dan mereka menolak didanai oleh negara. Ini sangat menarik karena di Indonesia, intelektual kita didanai oleh negara melalui perguruan tinggi negeri, didanai negara melalui hibah-hibah dikti, dan itu merupakan kelanjutan dari kebijakan teknokratik developmentalism pada masa Orde Baru. Aliansi antara ulama dan aliansi antara gereja dan negara di Eropa Barat menunjukkan pada masa yang sama ya, di mana ada kemerdekaan berpikir di dunia muslim, gereja-gereja Katolik sebagai perbandingan itu dipekerjakan oleh aristokrat. Jadi sebetulnya dunia Islam, masyarakat Islam pada saat itu jauh lebih progresif in terms of democracy dibandingkan dunia Barat. Tapi setelah abad ke-11 ada putar balik di Eropa Barat, di mana institusionalisasi pemisahan antara gereja dengan negara dilakukan dengan lebih sistematis, sekularisme yang berdampak pada kelas-kelas intelektual yang lebih dinamis, kelas bourgeois yang juga lebih dinamis, yang juga memunculkan gerakan pencerahan dan revolusi industrial. Paparan-paparan berikutnya itu paparan sejarah. He fleshed it out very detailed ways. Kalau perlu catatan saya, Mas Adi bisa saya serahkan ya dengan lebih rapi. Saya akan masuk ke dalam argumen intinya supaya nggak terlalu panjang ya. Karena ada satu bagian penting untuk mempertahankan argumen mengenai pembatasan intelektual kelas bourgeoisie dan tidak adanya jarak antara ulama dan negara yang mengakibatkan underdevelopment atau keterbelakangan di dunia muslim dan mungkin Indonesia juga, adalah karena pada abad 18 di mana abad 16 di mana industri percetakan, mesin cetak digunakan secara masif di Eropa Barat bersamaan dengan revolusi industri yang juga mengembangkan kapitalisme di saat yang sama dan dipermasalahkan oleh Benedict Anderson di bukunya mengenai Imagined Communities, di mana kemerdekaan Indonesia pun juga didorong oleh adopsi mesin cetak dengan menyebarkan gagasan-gagasan nation state merdeka dan berdaulat kepada negara-negara di Asia Tenggara. Sementara di Eropa Barat ada 13% orang yang bisa baca tulis pada saat yang sama, di Timur Tengah hanya ada 1%. Dan pada saat itu adopsi mesin cetak di Timur Tengah dan barangkali juga Indonesia itu terbatas, sehingga menyebabkan pula stagnasi kelas intelektual dan kelas bourgeoisie untuk menyebarluaskan gagasan-gagasan yang progresif. Dan pada era sejarah kontemporer, Prof. Kuru menekankan bahwa aliansi antara militer dengan ulama itu merespon ke dunia barat dengan cara-cara yang teknikal, tidak mempermasalahkan fondasi-fondasi pemikiran yang memungkinkan dunia barat itu mengejar ketertinggalan dibandingkan dunia Islam pada abad 11 sampai sekarang. Dan belum ada solusi alternatif atau kelas intelektual dinamis di dunia Islam termasuk Indonesia yang mampu merespon terhadap oligarki antara militer dengan ulama di Timur Tengah maupun juga di Indonesia. Pertanyaan penting dari Prof. Kuru adalah bagaimana jarak antara ulama dengan negara di Indonesia? Apakah ada proses mendekat ya dari ulama kita, pemikir-pemikir Islam kita kepada tatanan kenegaraan yang mengakibatkan semakin terbatasnya kelas intelektual dan bourgeois di Indonesia yang akan juga menyebabkan keterbelakangan demokrasi. Dan ketika mempertanyakan gimana ya kita menanggapi COVID-19, di berbagai khutbah sholat Jumat yang didatangi oleh Prof. Kuru di Amerika Serikat, ada ada, saya nggak tahu hadisnya, mungkin ada teman-teman sarjana Islam, saya hanya menerjemahkan, inovasi itu adalah deviasi, penyimpangan, dan penyimpangan itu tempatnya di neraka. Padahal nggak di flash out, nggak dijelaskan inovasi seperti apa yang nggak boleh, inovasi seperti apa yang sedang dipermasalahkan gitu, karena pada tingkat keseharian di khutbah-khutbah di masjid, kalau ada pelarangan pemikiran, pelarangan mempertanyakan hal-hal, maka yang terjadi adalah secara sosial ada upaya sistematis untuk menghambat kemajuan demokrasi Indonesia melalui indoktrinasi yang terjadi mungkin tanpa peran negara ataupun ulama secara sistematis ataupun pada tingkat kenegaraan di Indonesia. Mudah-mudahan Kuru, Ahmet, I hope I explain your arguments well. I focused on the key points that you have made. Bagi teman-teman, jika ada pertanyaan pada chat box, silakan digunakan. Bertanya langsung, saya juga akan bantu terjemahkan. Kalau mau menggunakan bahasa Inggris juga silakan. Saya dipesankan oleh panitia untuk meminta Prof. Hadis untuk memberi tanggapan barangkali karena saya lihat ada beberapa argumennya yang tumpang tindih dengan buku Islamic Populism-nya. Ahmet, before I give the floor to the audience, I'd like your permission to give Fedi Hadis the floor because I see some of your key arguments overlap with his Islamic populism thesis, although speaking about different historical periods. Kepada Prof. Fedi, saya persilahkan. Yeah. Yes, Ahmet.
Just checking, can you hear me now with my computer? I'm connected.
Yes, very clear.
Very good. I'm very happy that Professor Vedi Hadis is with us tonight in the morning. I read his book, Populism in Indonesia and the Middle East, and I'll be very happy to have an engagement with him. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ahmed. I'm very pleased to be here as well and to listen to your presentation. I have to say, and I mean this in the most sincere terms, that I was very fascinated by your book. I think it's a very unique book that provides us with a lot of theoretical and historical contributions and insights that I think will provide material for hundreds of seminars such as these for many years to come. I really think that your book is quite a unique accomplishment, Ahmed. I mean that sincerely. I have a couple of points to make, a couple of comments and questions, really, right? Regarding the theoretical framework and its historical application and some of its ramifications towards understanding the Muslim world, as well as directly or indirectly Indonesia today, if the committee will indulge me a few more minutes than normally a questioner would be given. So I think that one of the most important contributions that your book provides, which you maybe just talked about in passing in your presentation, is that it offers an incredibly strong corrective to the post-colonialist kinds of arguments about Islamic political, economic, and cultural stagnation being caused by Western imperialism, right? Your argument really is that that stagnation had begun, at least from the 11th century, internally within the Muslim world, and that paved the way really, or allowed for the broader setting that enabled Western colonialism and imperialism to subordinate the Muslim world. So there was an internal process that allowed that to happen. And I think that's a really important corrective to a lot of the, I think, knee-jerk kinds of reactions to Western imperialism in relation to Islamic societies that you have within the left or the right of politics in the Muslim world. I am though interested, and I don't know whether you actually do this in your book. I'm just really kind of interested in how, having situated yourself against those perspectives, how you situate yourself within the more classical interpretations of the development of, or lack of development of, Islamic societies, as, for example, you find in the classical Marxist and or Weberian traditions. Both of these traditions pay attention to the things that you pay attention to, that is, the presence or absence of an independent bourgeoisie, right, within historical trajectories, and pay attention also to the processes of state formation, right? I mean, there's the Weberian notion as well of the militarization of the state in Islamic history, the garrison cities and so on and so forth that I'm sure you're familiar with. So I wonder where you would situate yourself in relation to Marx and Weber, because I think a lot of it actually harks back to classical sociology, a lot of your theoretical framework. And to me, maybe a lot of it is not as explicit as I would actually enjoy it to be. Yeah. The second point is, you talk about the 11th century as setting a kind of trajectory, right? To which we are in the Muslim world still basically, adhering to, right? So 1,000 years of a particular trajectory, right? Now, I must say that the arguments are convincing, although instinctively, I do have concerns about the absence of ruptures in your analysis to accompany the continuities. Over 1,000 years and across so many societies over a wide geographical spread, I would have imagined many, many ruptures, whilst your story is about continuity. And really, colonialism and the rise of the nationalist movement, secular national states, and therefore the changing relationships between the four classes that you talk about, although they might be reconfigured in such a way so that they go back to some historically familiar setting. I mean, these are ruptures, right? And they must actually have their own historical legacies, right? Which affects the contemporary situation that we face now. And I just find that maybe that bit is less explicit, both maybe in your book and certainly in your presentation just now, okay? Okay, Inaya, can you give me 2 more minutes? Because I'm really excited about it.
He's very rarely excited, Ahmet. So
Yeah.
yes, you have 2 minutes.
So in the final analysis, right, when you say that it doesn't matter whether secular nationalists or Islamists control the state in Islamic society, right, you actually then go to a state-centric argument about the absence or existence of capitalist and or democratic progress, right? Now, the thing is that I wonder whether in doing so, you are sort of homogenizing the experiences of the West, for example, where where the state played a big role, for example, in the industrialization of later industrializing experiences, such as that of Germany, right? And maybe you're also not paying enough attention to the experiences of capitalist industrialization in East Asia, where the state also plays a huge role, and yet you have in the universities, you have the intelligentsia, etc., etc. Okay, and also when we talk about democracy, right? It seems to me that you have this particular attention to the role of the bourgeoisie, as in the Barrington Moore kind of analysis, right? Which is fine, right? But we also know that European democratization had to do with the emergence of social forces other than the bourgeoisie, right? Social democratic forces, labor forces, especially from the 19th century. Now, this absence in the Muslim world is not something that you talk about a lot. And I'm just wondering, in terms of Maxime Rodin's idea of a liberation Islam, for example, and its non-existence practically, is something that you would want to think about. And lastly, I was just slightly uncomfortable with, at the end, really, the analysis falls to the binary that I'm uncomfortable with about the heartlands of Islam and the peripheries of Islam, and how that binary explains different trajectories. I think that may potentially oversimplify some of the factors important to explain the Indonesian trajectory. Sorry, that was a long one, wasn't it? Sorry. I hope that was interesting though. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fedi Hadis. Ahmet, do you want me to recap the questions, or I can ask them along as you explain? But if I may, I'd like to translate some parts of the questions for the Indonesian audience. Profesor Fedi Hadis menanyakan mengenai posisi Prof. Kuru ya dalam diskusi sosiologi klasik, khususnya trajektori Weberian dan Marxian. Dan argumen-argumen dari Prof. Kuru menurut Prof. Fedi sangat meyakinkan. Tapi Prof. Fedi menanyakan bagaimana menjelaskan letupan-letupan ya ketika secara geografis, secara spasial ada proses sejarah dan trajektori sejarah yang unik spesifik pada tiap negara dan regio. Dan sementara tesis statementnya Prof. Kuru adalah keberlanjutan ya, continuity, historical continuity. Dan juga Prof. Fedi menanyakan unsur-unsur kelas pada negara sekuler nasionalis yang dibicarakan oleh Prof. Kuru, dengan penekanan pada tesis statement Prof. Kuru mengenai kelas borjuis, kelas intelektual, tapi di dunia barat maupun di beberapa bagian di dunia Islam juga ada gerakan kelas ya yang mendampingi gerakan-gerakan Islamis dengan posisi uniknya sendiri dalam relasi ulama dengan negara. Prof. Fedi mengingatkan bahwa karena Prof. Fedi juga sering menerima kritik yang sama mengenai homogenisasi pengalaman di Barat, dan ketika kita bicara mengenai demokrasi, bagaimana dengan literatur mengenai liberalisasi Islam atau absennya liberalisasi Islam. Dan untuk mencegah juga ada konklusi atau kesimpulan yang biner, karena mengungkapkan, menjelaskan, mengartikulasi, menggambarkan sampai warna-warna terkecil sangat penting bagi kita di Indonesia ya, di dunia Muslim mayoritas terbesar di dunia, untuk merefleksikan pengalaman kita dengan cara-cara yang tidak hitam dan putih. Gitu kira-kira. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu. Ahmet, time and place is yours.
Thank you. I truly appreciate. I would say that this is a set of, I think, one of the best set of criticism and comments I ever received. And Pak Wedi, thank you. 80 different reviews of my book have been written so far. Unfortunately, many critics only focus on the colonial aspect. They keep saying that colonization, and your criticisms are really refreshing and thought-provoking. And Inaya, do I have 55 minutes to answer?
Yes,
no, it's
you
a
do.
joke. So, and let me very briefly, though really it deserves about an hour of responding very important questions you ask. Let me go over 5-6 points very quickly because of the time limitation. First of all, you are right that my criticism of colonial and essentialist point of view and my argument about bourgeoisie and intellectuals have some engagement with existing Western literature. And you refer to 3 of them, Marx, Weber, and Barrington Moore. What I am trying to do is really come out with an original argument from Islamic history. That's why I never define my argument as Weberian or Marxist, etc. But in one page, I explicitly say that before me, of course, many scholars refer to the role of bourgeoisie. And if students read the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels, they see the emphasis on bourgeoisie, and that's the whole argument about Marxist analysis. But to this Barrington Moore and Karl Marx emphasis on bourgeoisie, I bring the role of intellectuals, because I see the Marxism is too much materialistic, too much material structuralist, and the missing component is the role of intellectual class, universities, scholars, thinkings, and ideas. And in my book, I try to bring together ideas and material factors. In both positive cases, like Muslim Golden Age, it was an achievement by certain material conditions and economic class, plus certain ideas and intellectual class. Then the stagnation was also happened not simply by the ideas of ulama, but also state structure and economic dimension. Therefore, of course, there is an engagement with Marxist notion of bourgeoisie, but there is also a very strong emphasis on ideas, and the Weberian notion there too, with the emphasis on ideology. That's one thing. Therefore, it's a synthesis of multiple schools with certain engagements with them. Second point, I think it's more important, is that for Marx and Weber, and even to some extent maybe Barrington Moore, the West is unique. It's the origin. It's like Adam and Eve, that beginning of everything. And I am saying no to them in the book, saying that, no, you are wrong. The West learned it from Muslims, explicitly or implicitly, and you either don't know it or don't acknowledge it. For example, Max Weber's in Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, he refers to the worldly asceticism. But the worldly asceticism combining religious devotion with worldly achievement was a Muslim characteristic from 8th to 12th century. But Weber says that Muslim is a warrior man, not a scholar or a merchant, because for him, Muslim is just Ottoman soldier or a Selçuk chivalry. And that's why I was very critical of Weber in my book for being Orientalist and really not knowing or acknowledging Muslims' contributions and how Muslims taught financial institutions, capitalism to Europe. Among the European scholars, I think among the seniors of them, Fernand Braudel, the French historian, is the one who explicitly acknowledged the Muslim contribution. And this French historian, Fernand Braudel, says that whatever Europe learned from as capitalism, they learn from Muslims. I think it was a very important thing for him to say. Most others just ignore the Muslim contribution. So that's my very brief answer to Weber and Marx. Coming to the second issue of the 1000 years, I think that was a main challenge for me, because in my first book, Secularism book, I was also challenged by the analysis of continuity and rupture, how to keep them both in the book, because I was recommending Turkey to change, saying that Turkey, you are too much French type assertive secularists, you have to change. But then I was analyzing that this secularism in Turkey has a century history. So how is it possible? So very briefly, first of all, in the Muslim history, I was trying to show ruptures and changes. For example, intellectually, Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah was a rupture and a very important opportunity, but Muslims unfortunately missed that opportunity. They ignore him. Before him, Ibn Rushd was an important rupture. He wrote a rebuttal to Ghazali, but Muslims mostly ignore it. Then came reforms, mostly state-centric reforms. For example, the first printing press in 18th century, Ibrahim Mutafarrika, was an important opportunity for Muslims to really break the vicious circle, but they couldn't. Then the Ottomans tried. Ottomans really took various steps forward in the 19th century. They abolished the blasphemy and apostasy law. They tried to Europeanize their education system. Muhammad Ali Pasha did reforms in Egypt, but they were too much state-centric. At the end, there were here and there packets of reforms, but mostly failed and didn't leave us a consistent theoretical, even systematic institutional legacy. Then why? I think the world history overall is a history of failure. Success is an exception. Success is a precious thing. Muslims had this precious thing between 8th to 12th century. Western societies had it between 18th century and today, maybe 2, 3, 4 centuries. It's very difficult. And what Muslims achieved was very exceptional. That's why when you look at 1000 years of ulama state alliance, you may think, oh, Ahmet's book is very pessimistic, depressive, but that's the word in China, in India, everywhere, even in Europe. The church state struggle in France, as I analyze in my first book, continued until 1905. And even today, here in the US, we have the problem with evangelical right-wing populism with Donald Trump and others. Therefore, it's not 1000 years of darkness in the Muslim and 1000 years of brilliance in Europe. No, but there are always certain back and forth transformations, complexities that I try to capture. But really, in terms of intellectual production, Muslim societies, especially the last 500 years, almost empty. I really try to find out every important intellectual contribution of the Ottoman Empire. There were very few, and the intellectuals at the end either punished or forgotten. Anyhow, but after the millennium, I want to be hopeful. And there are, I think, 2 major reasons for being optimistic about the future. First, these ulama state alliance and historical barriers do not have basis in Quran or Hadith. And because the Quran doesn't refer at all to either of these 2 groups, that's why they use one phrase in the Quran saying ulul amr minkum. Obey those have authority among you. And it's open to interpretation. It doesn't refer to state ulama. Ibn Taymiyyah in 13th century say this verse command Muslim to obey ulama and umara. But it is just an interpretation. because of the lack of any substance in Islamic texts, they fabricate a hadith saying that religion and state are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian. Without foundation, collapse, and that without guardian perishes. Why did they produce this fabrication? Because it's a Sasani maxim 3 centuries before Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, because there is no basis in the hadith. And finally, Ghazali himself, the architect of the system, at the age of 40, had a crisis, went to the mausoleum of Prophet Abraham, took an oath that he would never receive money from state again. He would never join the state politicians' gatherings again. He would never teach in madrasa, Nizamiya madrasas again. So even the genius who inspired the whole ulama state system had problem with it. He had inconsistencies. So this is really making me hopeful that it's not Islam, but it is a historical experience that need to be challenged and changed. And the fact that we already have 400 or 500 years of early Islamic experience also makes me optimistic that this 1,000-year history can end. Finally, we can have the rupture. Then we can write books about the rupture, how things get better, inshallah. So the third question you ask about states, the role of state. This is very important. So my policy recommendation is neither a stateless anarchy nor an attack to ulama. I want them to function within their boundaries. And in my chapter on socioeconomic development, chapter number 3, I compare East Asia with Middle East, because you are right that East Asia achieved economic growth despite authoritarianism. Out of 16 countries, 8 are democratic, 8 are authoritarian. Many, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, after a certain level of economic development, move to democratization. But some, like Singapore and especially China, persist as authoritarian. And when I compare East Asian authoritarian state and Middle Eastern authoritarian state, I see that 4 characteristics make East Asian one more developmental and not developmental in the Middle East. I like to summarize things in 3, but this time just 4. So first thing is that in East Asia, the state is authoritarian, but it also is governing effectively. Regarding criteria of safety, COVID measures, and many things, we have a World Bank criteria of governance. There is high efficiency of governance in East Asia, but very low efficiency of governance in the Middle East. For example, Egyptian state is authoritarian, but very inefficient, ineffective to help when there is an earthquake, etc. Second, in East Asia, authoritarian, but they invest heavily on education. In PISA score that evaluate secondary school students and high school students, East Asia mostly are in the top, and the Muslim majority countries are in the bottom because of the lack of educational investment. The third thing is that in East Asia, they don't have the clergy problem, and they focus on science and technology and change. We have the problem in the Middle East. And fourth and finally, the Middle East is too much oil-based rentier economy, not export-oriented. In East Asia, state important, but developmental state focus on export-oriented production, and this productive economy, even if its regime is authoritarian, still lead to economic growth. So therefore, it is possible to have, at least in the short run, to have a state-based economic growth. But in the Muslim, especially Middle Eastern case, states are too much militaristic, rentier, ulama state alliance, less emphasis on science and education, and less efficient. I think these are the problems. And finally, for real philosophical and scientific development, I still think that East Asia also is not a good story of success. In the long run, we saw that Soviet Union, after a short period of industrialization, it failed. And we'll see whether China really provides us some philosophical and scientific achievements or not. So, and the last 2 points. So we talk about Weber, 1000 years, state, society, and now the last 2 points. One is the emphasis on bourgeoisie. You are right, because it is step by step. The Muslim societies could not reach to the level of bourgeoisie. Therefore, we cannot talk about post-bourgeoisie social classes, unified labor, and the social forces that would challenge the bourgeoisie. So even if you don't like bourgeoisie, even if I don't like bourgeoisie, because I wouldn't really be seeing myself living in a society dominated by bourgeoisie. This is too much money-oriented, profit-oriented, capitalistic society that I don't want to live in it. But I need bourgeoisie to really limit the state, to defend my rights of private property. Because, for example, in Turkey today, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, bourgeoisie are weak. That's why state is able to seize private assets, confiscate private property. That's why Barrington Moore, as you refer, says bourgeoisie is necessary. No bourgeois, no democracy. It is not sufficient, but it is necessary. Once it limits the state, once it maintains private property protected, then other social classes, labor and others, can come to the scene. And finally, I totally agree with you about this center-periphery dichotomy, because in the literature, there are very misleading statistical orientalists saying that the heartland Muslim territories are having too much of time with Islam, therefore they are authoritarian. Democracy can only exist in periphery like Indonesia, Senegal, Bosnia. And my disagreement with them is that, first of all, they consider Central Asian republics as under Islam 1000 years, therefore too much Islamic, too much authoritarian. But I live in Central Asia. There is very little Islam there, unfortunately, because of the Russian colonization, then communist atheistic Soviet Union. To call Central Asia as heartland Islam is very wrong. It's very secular. The elite, they either don't know or doesn't practice. Of course, many people practice it, but it's not more Islamic than Indonesia. That's very wrong heartland notion. And then the problem here, as you also rightly mentioned, the argument of periphery, whenever Muslims succeed, these Orientalist essentialists, whenever Muslims fail, they say, oh, because of Islam. Whenever a Muslim put a good thing, for example, in West Africa, Muslim countries are more democratic than Christian countries. And whenever they examine, they say, these Orientalists, oh, because Islam that is eclectic, it's a periphery, it's a Sufi Islam, it's not real Islam. I think it's tautological to really see Muslim achievement not coming from Islam, from something else. But if there is terrorism and violence, oh, it's directly coming from Islam. And yes, that's why I try to be consistent with the concept of ulama-state alliance and additional concept of oil rent. And it can be anywhere. There is no periphery and heartland difference. So these are my responses to your very important question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was very, very enlightening. Thanks.
Thank you, Ahmed. Saya cukup sadar waktu ya kalau saya terjemahkan lagi. Nanti mungkin ada Bapak Ibu yang mau bertanya tapi nggak bisa. Saya coba ringkas jawabannya karena saya sambil mikir jadi agak susah. It's very difficult sharing when I'm also listening in like a student. So this is also new to me. Argumen Prof. Kuru yang merespon pertanyaan dari Pak Fedi tadi adalah bahwa meskipun tidak secara eksplisit disebutkan dalam bab bukunya, tapi banyak sekali sarjana-sarjana yang Prof. Kuru kutip yang juga membahas mengenai Marx dan Engels, dan bahwa secara tidak langsung Prof. Kuru mengatakan bahwa dia
Dan
meminjam
Weber
beberapa.
juga, Weber juga jangan lupa.
Oh iya, Marx, Engels, dan Weber khususnya dalam gagasan Weberian adalah mengenai ideologi dan bagaimana juga pada masa abad keemasan di dunia barat ide-ide kondisi material membentuk ide-ide tertentu dan juga membentuk kelas intelektual yang juga dibahas oleh beberapa sarjana yang juga mengutip kajian-kajian Marx. Bagi Prof. Kuru sendiri, kelemahan dari gagasan Weberian dan Marxian adalah bahwa mereka melihat perkembangan kapitalisme dari kacamata dunia barat, dan sebagai sarjana ketika mencetuskan tesis begitu kuat, antara tidak mengindahkan, mengabaikan, atau nggak tahu bahwa ada perkembangan di dunia Islam sejak abad ke-8 yang berhubungan dengan kelas intelektual dan kelas bourgeois pedagang yang membentuk pula kelas-kelas pemikir yang bertanggung jawab atau instrumental dalam pengembangan gagasan-gagasan keislaman, di antara yang disebut adalah Ibnu Khaldun dengan bukunya Mukadimah, dan beliau pun juga sebagai sarjana, buat ini catatan penting deh buat kita ya sebagai sarjana di Indonesia, bahwa dia pun menghadapi kegamangan gitu ketika ide hubungan antara tesis statement dalam Mukadimah ya mengenai hubungan antara ulama dan negara menghasilkan bentuk dalam struktur sosial tidak seperti dia inginkan. Lalu Al-Ghazali ketika dia usia 40 tahun mengatakan bahwa bersumpah bahwa dia nggak mau bergabung dengan negara, nggak mau ngajar di madrasah, padahal dia juga seseorang yang brilian yang menginspirasi analisis terhadap sistem yang juga mengalami pergumulan dalam dirinya untuk menghadapi dilema-dilema sosial. Ini berhubungan dengan pertanyaan mengenai mengenai Kemenak dan Kemendikbud yang mendanai universitas negeri dan universitas Islam ya di Indonesia. There's a question, Ahmet, about how do Indonesians, and also from your perspective, look at or understand better the funding to universities that go through two channels in Indonesia. The first is through the Ministry of Education, Culture, Research, and Technology, and the second is through the Ministry of Religious Affairs. To give a concrete example, Philips is part of the funding that goes from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, from UIII. I'm from Universitas Indonesia that receives funding from the secular Ministry for Education. The whole madrasah system is also organized under the Ministry of Religious Affairs. We have also had a historical experience of marginalization of Islamist politics under our authoritarian government, which includes repression to the press, whether historically, genealogically related to Masyumi, the political party that broke into two largest organizations, Muhammadiyah and NU in Indonesia, with their own intellectual traditions. The question is, how do we understand these different channels of funding with consequences to shaping the intellectual classes differently between these institutions? Are there any materials or reflections that you can share with us, Ahmet? Many thanks.
Thank you. So I receive similar questions for myself because I am teaching at a state university and funded by the California state. And I don't see any problem in my case, and for any case need to be analyzed case by case, because as long as a professor has the freedom to teach and write, as long as the funding does not force you or censor you on a particular direction, there is no problem with that. Having said that, the basic principle should be that each sphere, politics, economy, religious, academia, sports, may have certain autonomy in their criteria and pursue justice, but they may have connections and relations. In the Muslim Golden Age, for example, of course, many philosophers receive state patronage. Ibn Sina, Ibn Haytham, they receive money from politicians. So Islamic scholars mostly put a distance, but philosophers were receiving patronage to a certain extent, not fully, but at least partially. But the problem after 11th century, when ulama received money, they became propagandists and then promoting a particular state ideology. And they use their religious importance and prestige for establishing an orthodoxy and declaring others heterodox or infidels. So today, if a professor teach in a state university or receive funding at the personal level, the important is really freedom, whether you can freely express your thoughts. It's not real violation of principle, but overall, it's always better to have alternatives. And I think the American system, for example, is that there are state-funded institutions, but there are many private institutions. And if we as professors teaching in a state institution face censorship and problems, there's always an alternative we can move. And that creates the dynamism. And what you explained to me, the Indonesian case seems to have decentralization, alternatives, and dynamism. That's what really need to keep. If there's too much centralization and then a state control, eventually the censorship will come, freedom will be gone. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Although I was disconnected, and so I received the question from the committee, so I might have misread some parts. But I think your point about freedom and autonomy is an important one. Whether there are questions that we cannot ask in Indonesia about Islam or about the broader social change that affects the way Muslim societies or communities are formed here. And we do have a long history of repression. In the since the early 20th century, our independence movement was pushed by the intellectual bourgeoisie receiving education from the Dutch colonialists, which also mobilized Islamist, communist, and nationalist movements in the 1940s to 50s. We experienced genocide in 1965 for our communist intellectuals, and this kind of homogenized the kind of narratives that intellectual can talk about much throughout the 60s to the 90s. And you are right that decentralization is a key rupture point for Indonesians, but the task at hand, I think, for my generation, our generation of Indonesian intellectuals, is whether we can ask some questions, and whether that was instilled oppressively, repressively, or through market mechanisms, because there's no funding for it, there is no room for discussion, or we can receive direct intimidation. So I think your point about autonomy and freedom is an important one, which can also challenge the relationship between ulama and state, if any, in Indonesia, and keep that distance so that our autonomy is intact. May I translate that key point if I understood you correctly,
Yes,
to our Indonesian
I think,
audience?
you're right.
Ya, pertanyaan mengenai sarjana-sarjana akademisi di Indonesia, baik yang menerima pendanaan dari Kementerian Pendidikan maupun dari Kementerian Agama. Menurut Prof. Kuru, titik pentingnya yang perlu ditekankan adalah apakah kita boleh menanyakan hal-hal dengan bebas, memiliki otonomi, memiliki kemampuan, apakah kita menulis, apakah kita ngobrol warung kopi, atau kita meninggalkan sesuatu jejak ya pada kesarjanaan. Dan adalah bahan refleksi penting buat kita. Ada nggak sih hal-hal yang kita nggak bisa tanya? Karena kita tahu konsekuensi represifnya, intimidasinya, atau kita nggak berani tanya karena secara doktrinal nggak boleh, atau secara paradigmatik nggak diizinkan, atau karena mekanisme-mekanisme pasar, kita harus ngejar setoran, menghasilkan riset untuk klien, sementara kita nggak punya ruang independen untuk berpikir di luar kebiasaan. If we really want to be progressive Muslim intellectuals, then the key question is how do we maintain our autonomy? What material conditions can permit that or hinder that? Sehingga ideasinya, ide-ide, the kind of research and discussions that are permitted can be diversified, bisa diragamkan, ada alternatif, sehingga nggak ada satu kebenaran tunggal yang menguasai narasi akademik kita. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for that insight. It's really helpful. There's another question from Didi Sajali. Prof. Kuru, you suggested that Indonesian Islam is an outlier across the Islamic world, the Muslim world. How do you think the Islamic world currently perceives Indonesia? Is it still considered relevant, or is it considered a sleeping giant? Is Indonesia a serious contender to exchange ideas of Islamic thought? And how do Indonesians sell its outlier brand of Islam to the world? Time and place is yours, Prof.
Thank you. And let me first show you just at the beginning of my PowerPoint, because I prepared it for the panel and didn't have a chance to show. Just a few minutes. As you see, this is the English version, and it has these three philosophers in the cover page, because one philosopher, Greek science and Greek philosophy, they taught the middle gentleman, the Muslim philosopher. The Muslims taught two Renaissance philosophers. So the continuation is in this Renaissance painting, the three philosophers, Greek, Muslim, and the Western European, that really capture certain ideas in my book. That's why I choose that cover. Then this is the Indonesian translation. I'm very happy to have the same cover in the Persian too, but for the Arabic, they choose to have a very dark material in the cover page, a tyrant supported by the ulama. Then I asked the publisher, why didn't you choose a cheerful? They say, because your book is dark. It's about oppression, tyranny. I said, no, my book is not pessimistic book. It tries to give hope people for the future. That's at least make me more hopeful. Then, as I explained, there is this problem. Authoritarianism is the Muslim word, and Indonesia and others are part of this green Muslim majority country with many problems I summarize and discuss. And then with the history, I think this is an important part I wanted to show in the presentation. It's in the conclusion of my book, showing that after the 11th century, Europeans simply did not easily surpass Muslims. Between 12th and 17th century, there was 500 years of comparable development, but only after the 17th, Europeans surpassed Muslims. Then we ask about the rise of the ulama state under the Seljuks. Then came the Mongol invasion and the conquest of the Crusaders, and then Muslims established three empires. So I was born in Turkey. There is always this question, how did the Ottomans lose the glory? And today many TV series about the glory, but unfortunately, they understand glory in a very military sense. It should be more philosophical, more economic, not just the military sense. And then I talk about the printing press and colonization. So this is a map I prepare for my book, and Cambridge, of course, they get my idea and turn it into a book showing that after the stagnation came the colonization. So now the oil rent really found ulama state alliances. Recently, I wrote a 44-page report to turn my book into more policy-oriented recommendations. In addition to ulama state alliance, I look at its funding coming from oil. As now I'm answering the question about Indonesia. Indonesia is not in this table, luckily. It was in this table in 1970s, 80s, 90s, because it was a member of OPEC. It was an oil exporting country, but it's no longer. Because of depletion of oil reserves and then the domestic consumption, now Indonesia is an oil importer, no longer really based on oil money. That's very good. And that's really a problem in Middle East because oil hinders democratization. Oil fuels ulama state alliance because neither ulama nor state is an economically productive class. They need an external revenue, money. historically money was coming from land revenue distribution, ICTA and TMAR systems. Today, it's mostly coming from oil money and foreign aids, but it is not sustainable. There will be new technologies. Therefore, Muslims in the Middle East and elsewhere should be ready to the challenges of post-oil era. Oil era will end before the end of oil, as Stone Age ends before the end of stones. So on that point, Indonesia is lucky that it's no longer oil dependent economically. Then ulama state alliance complicated, but we see more decentralization, diversity, different groups in Indonesia, which is good too. Now, the question about the perception, I asked this question recently because I spent 2 months to write an article, just 900 words article about Indonesia, how it's perceived in the Middle East. And at the conclusion of the article, I said that, and I in fact referred to a senior journalist, James Dorsey, who wrote an essay saying that in the Middle East, Indonesia is mostly ignored and they didn't pay attention. Why? Because today in Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, there are leaders in each of these countries who claim to dominate, at least influence the Muslim world. Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, Iran since the revolution, MBS in Saudi Arabia, Sisi in Egypt, they all want to influence with an Islamic project their own. And they see Indonesian, Muhammadiyah and you and others as a competitor, therefore they don't want to give credit. But the advantage of Indonesian actors is that they are more diversified, whereas Turkish, Saudi, and other models is too much government-centric. And right now, there is a big trend in the Middle East, many public surveys showing that young people are living Islam, either as a practice or as a belief. Of course, many people are still devout Muslims, but in the young generation, in Turkey, in Iran, even in some Arab countries, the young people are really fed up and bored by the politicized Islam, too much traditional, too much conservative. According to a recent survey, 50% of Iranians says they are no longer Muslim. If this is not reliable, but if 40%, 30% say they are no longer Muslim, it's a big change in Iran. A major change in Turkey too, as a reaction to Tayyip Erdogan's populist Islamism. So under these circumstances, a more democratic, tolerant, more humanitarian, open-minded approach, not obsessed with Sharia state, not obsessed with caliphate, not obsessed with jihad. Any interpretation from Indonesia or elsewhere would find some people interested in it in the Middle East. And as I said, let me repeat that my article in just 2 weeks translated in 7 languages, Turkish, Bosnian, German, French, Indonesian, of course. It showed that there is really a global attention to Indonesia. And if I think Indonesia is able to really influence the other parts of the Muslim world rather than being influenced by them. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Kuru. I'd like to ask though, in order to be to influence more than we are influenced as Indonesian Muslim scholars in Indonesia, that would mean we would have to produce intellectual thinking. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. And maybe Indonesian scholars can take the initiative to get their writings translated into English, Arabic, Persian, etc., because that's the way to have an influence.
Thank you very much. There is a question from Pak Amir Hairullah. Following up regarding education funding under 2 ministries, he sees a compromise between 2 dominant ideologies, which is the nationalist ideologies and Islamist ideologies in Indonesia. in your opinion, can these two ideologies be reconciled, or is there a competition or struggle between the two powers in Indonesian politics?
That's an interesting question, because Islamism and nationalism were competitors, not only in the Muslim world, in Christian world too. Christianity and nationalism from 15th century onward, they really compete to dominate public discourse, etc. But recently there emerged a new version of populism, bringing religion and nationalism. And this is a very dangerous trend. Last year, when Tayyip Erdogan converted Hagia Sophia, the very old Christian church, then made a mosque by Ottomans and kept as a mosque about 500 years. Then Atatürk turned it into a museum. Then Tayyip Erdogan made it a church again. I wrote a very short essay for Georgetown University blog to criticize that it was a wrong decision to make it mosque today. Then BBC Hindi called me for an interview. I told them that I have no study about India. Why are you asking me to give an interview? They say, because you criticize Erdogan Hagia Sophia, and this week Modi in India is building a Hindu temple on the ground of the burned mosque Babara Masjid, where over 100 Muslims were massacred by the Hindu fanatics. And we are going to ask you in the interview the similarity. I said, oh, okay, let me extend it and make it 3. I said that I like to explain things in 3 points, right? Erdogan, Modi, and Trump. So of course they are different, but the similarity is that from Hungary and Poland's leader to Brazilian, Philippines, Turkey, India, Russia, Putin, Modi, Erdogan, they all try to bring together nationalism and religion to really use populism to stay in power. And it's an authoritarian trend. Unfortunately, now the world needs more democracy. Look, China is now persecuting millions of Muslim Uyghurs, putting 1 million of them in the concentration camps, and 10 million Muslims in China is really seeing an ethnic cleansing. Their tradition, religion, mosques, and their freedoms are attacked. But Muslim leaders don't say anything. When it comes to criticizing United States, United Kingdom, these populist leaders in Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they are very vocal. But when it comes to China, they are all silent. It shows their double standards. So we really need a public debate, free debate, in order to engage with the West, with China, with our own problems in a fair, just, and really free manner.
Thank you, Professor Kuru. If I may recapture your main argument, the problem is not with nationalist or Islamist ideologies, but whether or not the elite are taking advantage of the populist narratives that binds together Muslims or binds together nationalists, so they stay in power. And this is also reflected in the distance or closeness between ulama and state authority, which I think is everywhere in Indonesia, every electoral politics. It's really difficult to distinguish between candidates because they borrow the similar narratives to capture as wide a floating mass as possible, which I would like to return to your main argument, whether or not there are intellectuals, Muslims or secular in Indonesia, that are questioning these state powers in an outwardly fashion, and what happens to them, what are the consequences for them criticizing the government. I think that's a very important point. Thank you very much, Professor Kuru. Another question is, to what extent Indonesian Muslims can go hand in hand or are antagonistic towards market or liberal economic thought? This is a really good question. How do you think Islamic thought, Islamic intellectual thinking, whether in the past 1,000 years or during its golden age, respond to classical economic or market-based economics? Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. So once again, every institution has a purpose and function as long as it really follows its boundaries and let others be autonomous and functioning. State in the Muslim world in many countries is too aggressive, trying to dominate everywhere. This is a state-centric, and then it is justified by the ulama. Normally, state is a helpful thing. State protect us. If there is domestic violence, you call the police. That's where state is needed. Ulama is needed. They are needed to defend morality, moral principles, religious values, ethics. But if they don't respect other boundaries, they dominate economy, they try to dominate intellectual life, they create corruption, injustice, and justice, adale, is gone. Same for market. As I said, and let me elaborate a little bit, if capitalism is with no boundary, then we see in American history, slavery, plantations, exploitation, worldwide capitalism, destroying environment. It's an entire disaster that can really destroy the world. We have to control corporations. There should be regulation of the market. Capitalism needs to be domesticated. But in the Muslim world, since private entrepreneurs are so oppressed, my book coming with an emphasis on defending both intellectuals and entrepreneurs. But if I see one day that intellectuals become all Platonic, like Plato's republics, they say we will rule as philosophers and dominate the entire world, I will write a book against intellectuals, saying that no, you cannot dominate the world. It's not up to you to rule the world. The world should be ruled by everyone, with every group together.
Thank you very much. That's a strong point. It's not that you're vouching for intellectuals to be in power, but intellectuals in the modern world, in the contemporary world, in the 21st century, are in a better position to play a role in redistributing access and wealth to maintain democracy. So at a certain point, if historical condition results in powerful intellectuals or intellectuals that are close to the state, then you too would criticize those kinds of intellectuals. Did I understand you correctly?
Definitely. So, for example, during the communist Soviet Union, communist ideologues, intellectuals were like the ulama. They were embedded to the system and help authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And same thing for the market question. If the market is out of control, it can dominate us. We don't want domination by market.
Yeah. So the strategy is to redistribute every accumulation, whether power or wealth or capital. Pak Komara terjawab ya pertanyaannya. Pertanyaan berikutnya, the next question is methodological. You touched upon, actually Mbak Zahra bukan Marxist class structure, tapi both Weberian ideas and Marxist. So Prof. Kuru is critical to both Marxist and Weberian ideas and would like to set forth Muslim history that actually preceded discussions, scholarly discussions about social systems and capitalist systems. And the rest of her questions is the analytical framework or theoretical background that you had at the beginning of your project, and your process of synthesizing, perhaps. You can elaborate further. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. So I have been thinking about the problem of dichotomizing agency and structure, whether, for example, Khomeini made the Iranian revolution or the revolution came. I think both are important, agency and structure. Iran had certain conditions and Khomeini played a role as a leader. Both are important. Another debate in social science we have is the relationship between ideas and material factors. Whether certain Sunni ideas of Ghazali and others, anti-philosophical, anti-rationalist, are the key factor, or it's all about economy and politics. And I think that both are important. That's why in my book, I try to bring them together. It was challenging. The concept of ulama state really helped me to bring together, because you have the agency, we have who the ulama are and state authorities, but there is also the institutional structure, madrasas for the ulama, the economic structure, the state structure. Similarly, the ulama state alliance is a very complex phenomenon that includes certain ideas. Basically, the Ash'ari and to some extent Maturidi Kalam theology, and usul fiqh of Imam Shafi, and in fact, usul fiqh of Imam Shafi dominate all four mazhabs. So I grew up in Turkey, called itself Hanefi, but Turks really follow Imam Shafi as fiqh methods. That we can have another webinar on that, and I'm writing an article on this issue. That's the ideas of ulama state alliance. But ulama state alliance also has economic basis, oil rents, agricultural revenues, dominating the markets and the state control. So therefore, rather than a Marxist analysis of Foxian economy or Weberian culture and ideas, I think we need a synthesis. And that's what I learned from Islamic history. And let me conclude saying that another project I am now working on, the question why Muslims were so successful in developing hospitals and obligatories, so two important scientific institutions. One is hospital for medical science, sorry, not obligatories, observatories. So for the astronomical observation, Muslims build world-class hospital and observatories. But Muslims really failed to build a parliament. This is the main problem. No parliament. The parliament, as we know today, is a European innovation. In different parts of Europe, there is councils, assembly, parliament, house of Congress, Senate, whatever you name it. The Muslim bourgeoisie, therefore, in the golden age, 8th to 12th century, since there is no parliament as a political body, they couldn't protect their influence in society. And then other forces came with political domination, and the bourgeoisie or merchant class didn't have a political assembly, a political basis. But in England, Netherlands, and later on in France, the bourgeoisie established parliament, politically organized. And in England, they killed the king. They behead the king. In Netherlands, they established a republic. That's how they achieved. So for the future, I think the parliament, although we didn't innovate it, it's very important. And now it's in decline. Look, in Egypt, parliament is not important. It's all about Sisi. In Turkey, the Turkish parliament has no authority, despite the fact that Turks have 150 years history of parliament. It's now all about Tayyip Erdogan, just one man. I think this is something Muslims really need to think about, how to make politics dominate by a group assembly, and how the merchant class has an impact on politics to protect private properties through assembly or parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kuru. There is a follow-up question from Bu Zahra. You mentioned intellectuals, which reminds Abu Zahra of Gramscian ideals. who plays the roles of challengers or counter hegemonic strategies in this narrative?
Thank you. So Islam now is a source of legitimacy in many countries. In Iran, I think it's the most theocratic among the Muslim majority countries. Now Taliban's Afghanistan is a competitor. So the challenging the hegemony now in Iran is coming within the Islamist discourse, reinterpreting Islamist discourse. But even the more secular countries, Islam as a public discourse is a very important source of legitimacy. And progressive individuals should not really leave aside Islam. We should learn Islam, engage with Islam, understand the complexity. Otherwise, if intellectuals and progressive people, if they just focus on secular things and become ignorant of Islam, it's happening in the Middle East, many countries, then Islam is dominated by radicals, Salafis, to traditionalists. I think there's a problem now that traditionalists are holding Islam and progressive people just are ignorant of Islam. This is a major problem.
That's an important point, because many of us were raised in the Al-Azhar or Madrasah system, and we were secularized later on, and also Anglophile. So that's an important note. There's one last question from Soraya Fadal. You said in 8th to 10th century Islamic, the values of Islamic philosopher was used by Umara to run the state and society, and there's a closeness between the two. Do you think Muslim intellectuals should return to these values? And the second is your opinion about media, digital media, and constructing Islamic representation in the context of a democratic country. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think in the golden age, in the 8th to 12th centuries, there is again a polarized debate about it. Certain Orientalists or essentialists, starting with the French philosopher Ernest Renan, said that golden age had nothing to do with Islam and Muslims. It's all about Christians, Jews, agnostics, etc. So they are wrong. I document in my book that many Muslim scholars contribute together with Christians and Jews. But some Islamists, and when I grew up in Turkey, I keep hearing that the golden age was all about Islam when Muslims are devout, practicing Muslims. But then we decline because of the lack of religion. We are different from Europe. Europeans, when they were religious, they were backward. They left their religion, they became progressive. But Muslims are different because when we are religious, we are progressive, but progressive in not ideological sense, in terms of material progress, they say. But therefore, we just need religion. So that's a debate I engage and show that no, golden age had certain Muslim characteristics, but it's not all about religion. It was about diversity, coexistence, Muslims, Christians, Jews together. So that's really what we need today, that rather than segmentation, ghettos, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jews against each other, or Alevi, Sunni, Shia, Sunni, we have to be more inclusive and understand each other. And that's the possibility of building a democracy and development.
Thank you so much. We're now running out of time. Professor Kuru, do you have any final statements before I give the floor to our Dean, Mas Philips?
I'm just would like to emphasize how thankful I am to Inaya, Mas Adi, Mas Philip, and Pak Wedi, and all other questions. And I'm very happy to have this engagement with your esteemed participants tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, energy, thoughts, reflections that we carry even after this discussion. Kepada Mas Philips, kami persilahkan untuk menutup diskusi.
Thank you, Mbak Inaya. I don't think I can add more values to the discussion, and it's very inspiring comments and response from Mas Fedi Hadis. I think was sharp as usual, and the questions from the audience also, I think, keep Professor Ahmet Kuru busy during the session in responding and finding the right and legitimate response to all the questions. And I thank you everybody who are joining this discussion this morning. And probably this is a question to myself. I was wondering why in the past few years, past 5 years, 10 years, Turkish thinkers lead the ways. You know, we have Professor Ahmet Kuru working on the political science aspect of this, questions of Islam, democracy, and development. And we have Professor Timur Quran at Duke University working on the political economy aspects of the development within the Muslim societies in general. And our last discussion at the MIKo, we had Mustafa Akil working on the philosophical aspect of Muslim minds and so on. So this is interesting because all Turkish actually. And
in fact, we are all three of us are good friends.
Exactly. So I think this should inspire all of us in Indonesia in particular, that we, although some might think, some in the Middle East might think that we are on the periphery, but actually, as Professor Ahmet Kuru pointed out in the discussion, we are one of the largest Muslim democracy, if you will. So we should be able to shape in terms of influence and thinkings and coming from Indonesia in particular and in Southeast Asia to contribute to the dynamics between the Indonesia and the West, Indonesia and the Middle East, and contribute to the intellectual and literature development. Thank you once again, Professor Ahmet Kuru.
So let me just say that, yeah, you mentioned periphery, but Indonesia is at the center of my heart and my mind. And
right.
Other than United States, it's the only country where I've been teaching. So now with Pak Philip, I'm teaching at UIII, and I never taught in Turkey. So Indonesia is the second country I'm teaching. Thank you for that too.
All right. We look forward to meeting you physically sometimes next year.
Inshallah.
Thank you, Mbak Inaya. I return the screen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bapak Ibu. It was a really rich discussion, not only because we had a really excellent speaker in full command of 1,000 years of historical continuity and detail, sumber dan bahan refleksi untuk kita di Indonesia. It comes with a hope that there are stronger intellectual thinking in Indonesia, and also a critical distance against the state and also militaristic leanings in the kind of policies or narratives, populist narratives that will come in the next elections. I hope this is not the only discussion that we have. Great thanks to MIKo, Pa Philips, to give the time and space. Also, thank you to Professor Kuru for your time and energy. And special thanks to Mas Adi, who made all of this possible by contacting us one by one. It's much appreciated. I hope our academic laboring goes on to be redistributed to more and more people, as Professor Kuru kindly reminded us. Many thank you, Bapak Ibu. Semoga sehat terus, lahir batin. Terima kasih. Mohon maaf atas segala kekurangan.
Thank you, Mbak Inaya juga.
Thank you.
Great moderator. Thank you. Bye.